The heavy wooden door creaked as Jason stepped into the dimly lit foyer of the house that held so many memories. It had been years since he'd walked these floors, the same polished oak floors his mother had once cleaned with a fierce dedication that seemed to keep the family together. Now, at 23, fresh out of college and directionless, Jason was back. The house felt like a shell of what it once was, much like Jason himself. Steve, his father, stood at the foot of the staircase, his face splitting into a warm smile as he spread his arms wide. "Jason, it's good to have you home, son." Steve looked older than Jason remembered, his once dark hair now streaked with gray, but the vitality in his eyes remained the same. Behind him, quietly stepping into the room, was Betty, his stepmother. Betty was a striking woman, not in the overt way that turned heads in a crowd, but in the kind of understated elegance that commanded respect. Her sandy blonde hair was always perfectly in place, her movements graceful, her smile warm and yet guarded. Jason had never known her well. She married Steve just 2 years after his mother had died, and though she made his father happy, Jason kept his distance, unsure of how to feel about this woman who now occupied his mother's place. "You must be exhausted," Betty said, her voice soft, reassuring. "I made your favorite chicken pot pie." Jason managed to smile, thankful for the gesture, but inside he felt the weight of being here again. Moving back home was supposed to be temporary, a place to land while he figured out his next step. But something in the air, something about returning to the place where his life had taken so many sharp turns, filled him with unease. That night, after a dinner filled with polite conversation and catching up, Jason found himself in his old room, lying awake in the dark. His future felt like a black void, an endless series of unknowns he wasn't ready to face. He glanced out the window, wondering how long he could hide in this house, pretending life wasn't moving forward without him. It was nearing midnight when Jason heard a soft knock on his door. He sat up, startled. "Yeah?" The door creaked open slowly, and Betty appeared in the doorway, her figure outlined by the faint glow from the hallway. She was wearing a simple nightgown, her hair down, a look of concern on her face. "I noticed your light was still on. Can I come in?" she asked gently. Jason nodded, sitting up straighter as she stepped into the room and sat at the edge of his bed. He felt a strange tension build in the air, something he couldn't quite place. Betty had always been kind to him, always tried to bridge the distance between them. But it was only in this quiet moment, in the intimacy of the late hour, that Jason noticed just how much effort she had made to be a part of his life. "You seemed restless at dinner," Betty said, folding her hands in her lap. "Is everything okay?" Jason sighed, rubbing his face. "I don't know. It's just life feels kind of stuck. I thought I'd have everything figured out by now, you know? But here I am, back home, and I don't even know where to start." Betty smiled, her expression softening. "It's normal to feel that way, Jason. You've just graduated, and the world expects you to have all the answers. But it's okay if you don't. You have time." There was something about the way she said it, the calm in her voice, that made Jason relax for the first time in weeks. He looked at her, noticing the faint lines around her eyes, the way her face carried a mix of strength and tenderness. In that moment, Betty felt less like the stranger who had married his father, and more like someone who truly understood him. Without thinking, he reached out and placed his hand over hers. The touch lingered. Betty's eyes widened slightly, and she looked at him with a mixture of surprise and something else, something Jason couldn't quite define. A subtle tension seemed to pulse between them, a tension that made his heart race. He pulled his hand back quickly, shaking his head as if to clear it. "Sorry, I don't know why I..." But Betty didn't move away. Instead, she gave him a long, searching look. "It's okay, Jason," she whispered. "Sometimes we just need someone to hold on to, even if we don't understand why." The days that followed were marked by a growing closeness between Jason and Betty. It was subtle at first, long conversations over breakfast when Steve had already left for work, stolen glances when they passed each other in the hall. The house was full of silent moments that felt charged, like a storm waiting to break. Jason tried to push the thoughts away, tried to remind himself that Betty was his father's wife, that whatever was happening between them was wrong. But the more time they spent together, the harder it became to ignore the strange connection pulling them closer. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jason found himself alone with Betty in the kitchen. They were washing the dishes after dinner, a quiet task made unbearable by the tension in the air. When Betty reached across him to grab a plate, her hand brushed his arm. The touch was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through him. Their eyes met, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. "Jason," Betty's voice was barely a whisper, her hand resting on the edge of the counter, as though she were steadying herself. "We need to talk about what's happening between us." Jason's chest tightened. He had been avoiding this conversation, hoping the feelings would fade if he just ignored them long enough. But Betty wasn't ignoring them anymore. "I don't know what's happening," he admitted, his voice strained. "But I can't stop thinking about you. I know it's wrong, I know I shouldn't feel this way, but..." Betty turned toward him, her eyes filled with the same mixture of guilt and desire that had been gnawing at him for days. "I feel it too," she said, her voice trembling, "and I don't know what to do about it." Jason took a step closer, his pulse racing. Every rational thought told him to stop, to walk away, but something stronger than logic was pulling him toward her. "Maybe we don't have to know right now," he said quietly. "Maybe we can just take it slow." Betty's gaze dropped to the floor, and she nodded slowly, her voice barely audible. "But we have to be careful. Steve can never find out." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of stolen moments and whispered conversations. Jason and Betty continued to tiptoe around the growing tension between them, careful never to cross a line when Steve was around. But when he wasn't, they spent hours talking in the quiet corners of the house, walking through the backyard late at night when the world was asleep. Each encounter brought them closer to the edge of something dangerous, something neither of them knew how to control. One night, after Steve had gone out for drinks with his friends, Jason and Betty sat in the living room. The lights were dim, casting long shadows across the walls, and the only sound was the soft crackle of the fireplace. They sat close, closer than they ever had before, their knees almost touching. "Do you ever wonder what life would have been like if you hadn't married my dad?" Jason asked, his voice low, hesitant. Betty looked at him, her eyes reflecting the flicker of the fire. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But life doesn't give us those choices, Jason. We make decisions, and we live with them." "But what if we could change things?" Jason pressed, his voice soft but urgent. He wasn't sure where the words were coming from, but they poured out of him, fueled by the unspoken tension that had built between them for weeks. Betty didn't answer right away. She stared into the fire, her expression unreadable, and Jason began to wonder if he had gone too far. But then she turned to him, her eyes filled with something that looked like both regret and longing. "Jason," she began, her voice thick with emotion, "we can't change what's already happened. I love your father. He's been good to me. But this, whatever this is between us, it's real too. I didn't expect it. I didn't want it. But it's here." Her words hung in the air, fragile and dangerous. Jason felt his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing as he struggled to make sense of the swirling emotions inside him. He had never meant for any of this to happen, but now he couldn't deny what he felt. He reached out, his fingers grazing the back of her hand. "I know it's wrong," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I can't stop." Betty's breath caught in her throat, and for a long moment they sat in silence, the weight of their confession pressing down on them. Finally, Betty pulled her hand away and stood, her movements slow and deliberate. "We can't do this, Jason," she said, her voice trembling. "We can't keep pretending like this is something we can control." Jason stood too, the distance between them suddenly feeling vast. "What are we supposed to do then? Just ignore it?" Betty shook her head, her eyes brimming with tears. "I don't know, but if we keep going down this road, it's only going to end badly, for both of us." Before Jason could respond, the front door opened, and Steve walked in, his jovial voice breaking the heavy silence in the room. "Hey, what's going on in here?" Steve asked, oblivious to the tension that had filled the room moments before. "You two look like you've seen a ghost." Betty forced a smile, wiping her eyes quickly. "Just talking," she said, her voice shaky. "Jason was telling me about his plans for the future." Jason nodded stiffly, his heart still racing from the near confession. "Yeah, just catching up." Steve smiled, unaware of the emotional storm brewing beneath the surface. "Well, don't stay up too late, you two. Tomorrow's a big day family brunch with Betty's sister, remember?" As Steve disappeared down the hall, Jason and Betty exchanged a long, meaningful look. They both knew the conversation wasn't over, but for now, it would have to wait. The tension in the house became unbearable over the next few days. Every glance, every word exchanged between Jason and Betty was charged with unspoken emotion. They kept their distance when Steve was around, careful to maintain the facade of normalcy, but the pressure was building, and Jason knew it was only a matter of time before something gave. One afternoon, while Steve was at work, Jason and Betty found themselves alone in the house again. The air between them was thick with anticipation, both of them acutely aware that they were teetering on the edge of something dangerous. Jason tried to distract himself with a book, but his eyes kept drifting to Betty as she moved around the kitchen, her presence consuming his thoughts. He couldn't take it anymore. He stood abruptly, crossing the room to where she stood. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low, almost pleading. Betty looked up at him, her expression torn. "I know," she whispered. "But talking won't fix this, Jason." "Then what will?" he asked, desperation creeping into his voice. "I can't keep pretending like nothing's happening between us." Before Betty could answer, the sound of the front door opening echoed through the house. Jason froze, his heart leaping into his throat. Steve wasn't supposed to be home this early. They exchanged panicked glances as Steve's footsteps grew closer. "Hey, I got off work early," Steve called out as he stepped into the kitchen, his cheerful tone grating against the tension between them. "Thought we could all grab an early dinner together." Betty forced a smile, her voice tight. "That sounds great, Steve." Jason, feeling trapped, muttered an excuse about needing to clear his head and quickly made his way outside. The cool air did little to calm his racing heart as he walked down the quiet street, his mind spinning with guilt, confusion, and a growing sense of dread. He knew things couldn't go on like this. The secret he and Betty were hiding was a ticking time bomb, and it was only a matter of time before it exploded. A week passed, the tension in the house becoming almost unbearable. Jason and Betty avoided being alone together as much as possible, but the unspoken emotions between them lingered in every glance, every accidental touch. Steve, oblivious to the turmoil brewing beneath the surface, continued on as if everything was normal. But everything changed one evening. Jason had stayed out late, trying to clear his head with a long drive. By the time he returned home, the house was dark and quiet, save for the faint glow of light coming from the living room. As he stepped inside, he heard voices, Steve's raised in anger and Betty's trembling with guilt. Curiosity and dread flooded him as he crept closer, stopping just outside the doorway. He could hear Steve's voice clearly now. "I don't understand," Steve was saying, his voice thick with confusion. "What the hell is going on, Betty? You've been distant for weeks. I thought we were happy." Jason's heart sank. He had feared this moment, but now that it was happening, he felt powerless to stop it. "I've tried, Steve," Betty said, her voice breaking. "But I can't keep pretending everything's okay. There's something I need to tell you." Jason's breath caught in his throat. This was it. The moment everything came crashing down. I don't know how to say this," Betty continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "But Jason and I." The silence that followed was deafening. Jason felt his stomach drop as Steve's voice, now quiet and deadly, cut through the air. "What did you just say?" Before Betty could respond, Jason stepped into the room, his heart pounding in his chest. "Dad, wait," he said, his voice shaking. "Let me explain." But Steve was already on his feet, his face contorted with rage and betrayal. "Explain," he shouted, his fists clenched at his sides. "You've been sneaking around behind my back with my wife, and you think you can explain that?" Jason felt a wave of guilt and shame wash over him. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen, Dad. It just did." Steve's eyes were wild with anger, his hands shaking as he pointed at Jason. "Get out," he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "I don't want to look at you. I don't want you in this house." Jason stood frozen, the weight of his father's crashing down on him. For a moment he considered pleading, explaining that it hadn't been intentional, that he hadn't wanted to hurt anyone. But the truth was, there was no excuse for what he had done. Without another word, Jason turned and walked out of the house, the door slamming behind him. The days that followed were some of the darkest Jason had ever experienced. He moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of town, away from the house that had once been his home. He hadn't spoken to Steve since the night of the confrontation, and the silence was unbearable. Betty hadn't called either, and Jason wasn't sure if that was for the best or if it made things worse. A part of him missed her, longed for the connection they had shared, but another part of him knew it was all built on lies and betrayal. Jason spent his days in a haze, replaying the events in his mind, wondering how everything had spiraled so far out of control. He had never meant to hurt his father, but now the damage was irreparable. It was Steve's silence that hurt the most. Jason had always admired his father, looked up to him even in the moments when their relationship had been strained. Now, that bond felt shattered beyond repair. One evening, a week after the confrontation, Jason received a text from Betty. It was brief, but the message was clear: "We need to talk." They met at a small cafe on the outskirts of town, far from the prying eyes of anyone who might recognize them. Betty looked tired, her face drawn and pale, and Jason felt a pang of guilt at the sight of her. "I've left Steve," she said quietly, not meeting his eyes. Jason's heart sank. "I'm so sorry, Betty. I never wanted this to happen." Betty shook her head. "It wasn't just you, Jason. There were problems in our marriage long before you came back. I had been unhappy for a while, but I didn't want to admit it. I didn't want to hurt Steve. But I can't keep living a lie." They sat in silence for a long time, both of them weighed down by the consequences of their actions. "What happens now?" Jason asked, his voice hollow. "I don't know," Betty admitted, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "But we can't keep pretending that what we had was real. It wasn't. It was born out of confusion, out of loneliness. I care about you, Jason, but this what we did, it was wrong." Jason nodded, the truth of her words sinking in. What they had shared had been intoxicating, but it had also been destructive. They had hurt the people they loved the most in the process. "I'm leaving town," Betty said after a long pause. "I need to get away from all of this, start over somewhere new. Maybe you should do the same." Jason looked down at his hands, feeling the weight of everything he had lost. "Maybe you're right." They parted ways that evening, their goodbye filled with an understanding that neither of them could undo the past. The road to redemption would be long and difficult, but Jason knew it was a journey he had to take, alone. The house was silent as Jason packed his few remaining belongings, preparing to leave the place that had been both a home and a prison. He glanced around one last time, memories of his childhood flashing before his eyes. This was where everything had fallen apart, but it was also where he had learned some of the hardest lessons of his life. As he stepped outside, the cool evening air washed over him, and for the first time in months, he felt a sense of clarity. There was no going back, but there was a way forward, a way to rebuild, to start over, and maybe someday to find peace. Jason took a deep breath and walked toward his car, ready to face whatever the future held. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe, give it a thumbs up, hit the bell, and drop a comment. Your feedback is greatly appreciated.